The PlayStation 5 generation has been extremely successful for Sony. The PS5 is selling incredibly well, staying fairly on par with its predecessor despite its early production issues, its significantly higher price, and the world's current economic challenges. They've watched their main competitor flounder, all while making more money than ever before. But through it all, it still feels like something is missing, and that something is generation-defining first-party experiences. It's a sad deterioration of what was once a defining characteristic of this brand. And what's even sadder is that almost all of this was avoidable. As a big PlayStation fan who keeps up with everything the company is doing, I have found myself disgusted by the mismanagement I've seen over the past several years. Today I want to go through it all and give you an idea of how bad things have gotten and discuss what got us here. In 2019, PlayStation underwent some major leadership changes as they prepared for the PS5 generation. In February of that year, Jim Ryan was promoted to President and Chief Executive Officer of Sony Interactive Entertainment. 9 months later, longtime head of PlayStation first-party studio Shuhei Yoshida announced he would be stepping down and focusing on PlayStation's new initiative with indie games. Shuhei was replaced with Hermen Hulst, who had co-founded Guerrilla Games and helped create the Killzone and Horizon franchises. This is where our story begins. The PS5 got off to a great start, and early on, the Jim Ryan-Hermen Hulst regime seemed to be moving in the right direction. Jim Ryan did a very good job navigating the new console launch, even amidst some very difficult circumstances that were outside of their control. He didn't always have a great understanding of games, and was pretty clearly not a gamer himself, but he was a decent businessman who understood that side of the industry. As for the games themselves, this responsibility fell on Hermen Hulst, who PlayStation fans, myself included, were pretty high on at the time. And for the first few years of PS5, it seemed things were progressing as normal. By 2022, we had gotten new games from Insomniac, Guerrilla, Santa Monica, Bluepoint, and Housemarque. You really can't ask for much more than that. But while Hermen soaked in the praise, much of the fan base was missing an important detail. We all know that games take several years to make, and so with this in mind, all of these games we got early on in the PS5 lifecycle were still Shuhei Yoshida's games. All of them had been greenlit and put into production by him before stepping down in 2019. Now that those games are out, it was time to truly see what Hermen could do. And for his first big move as head of PlayStation Studios, we got the now infamous live service push. PlayStation has always had stellar first-party output, but if there's one thing that's been missing, it's a multiplayer series. While Xbox found major success with Halo and Gears, Sony was just never quite able to replicate that formula. The closest they ever got was probably SOCOM, but that series died with PlayStation 3. Other games like Resistance or Killzone had decently popular multiplayer modes, but it was never anywhere close to their competitors. And the problem is, while PlayStation was busy perfecting their single-player games, the industry had moved in a completely different direction. Live service multiplayer games were now dominant in terms of both money made and, maybe even more importantly, time spent playing. Sony had been a big benefactor of this, with PlayStation 4 and 5 becoming the go-to home console for players to get their Fortnite, Warzone, or Apex Legends fix. And as the platform holder, they could see how much money was being made here. So they set out a plan to ensure they could finally find their own multiplayer live service success. The plan was fairly simple. Invest money into tons of different projects, understanding that some will succeed and some will fail. But if just one can really hit, it will easily pay off the development costs of all the other games around it, and then some. In other words, PlayStation was going to attempt to fail-proof the live service model. A bunch of projects got spun up, with Sony projecting in May 2022 that they would launch 12 different live service games by 2025. And perhaps the biggest investment of all came just a few months later, with Sony acquiring Bungie for a whopping $3.7 billion. It was said they wanted to acquire Bungie in order to tap into their live service and multiplayer expertise from their years of supporting Halo and Destiny. PlayStation was all in, but now the real work was going to begin, and these projects would need to actually come together. It's been 3 years since this bold claim of 12 different live service games. And as we get closer to the end of 2025, it was expected they would all be here by now. But in reality, we have been subjected to arguably the largest misstep we've ever seen from PlayStation's first party. Let's go through all of the public and behind the scenes details to really get a sense of the absurdity. Of course, we'll need to talk about Concord, the biggest failure in the history of PlayStation Studios. I already made a whole video about why Firewalk's hero shooter flopped, so we don't need to get back into it here, especially because, to be honest, what concerns me most about Concord is not the fact that it failed. What scares me is that PlayStation had no idea it was going to fail. In fact, they pretty clearly thought the exact opposite. How do I know this? Well, just look at how PlayStation treated it before release. It was prominently featured across multiple state of plays. It had merchandise and a limited edition controller available on the PlayStation Store, something they typically only do for their biggest IPs like Spider-Man, God of War, or Horizon. And they even collaborated with Amazon to create a Concord-themed episode of their gaming anthology series, Secret Level. But most blatant of all was Sony's decision to purchase the development studio a few months before Concord was set to launch. This decision right here is what terrifies me the most, and has me questioning those in charge. When Sony chose to purchase Firewalk, they did so after seeing the game in a nearly completed state. How can their leadership look at a game like Concord and think it was worth that level of investment? Let's imagine a different scenario, where PlayStation agrees to publish Concord, gives a studio full of highly qualified industry veterans a ton of money, and then waits for the game to release. There's a level of plausible deniability there, where you could say, oh, the team had a good idea and just didn't deliver. But going the extra mile to purchase the studio outright and put merchandise and multimedia crossovers into place before they even ship the game shows a level of belief that cannot be ignored. Speaking of, Sony also went ahead and acquired Haven Studios, the developers of the upcoming Fair games, which has still not been released. And as of the time of this video, the game's future is in turmoil, with studio founder Jade Raymond and creative director Daniel Drapo leaving the studio in recent months following the apparent negative reception to a closed playtest. But yet again, Sony seemed completely unaware that this was going to happen, purchasing the studio and officially making them a part of PlayStation because they believed in the project so much. And let's not forget about Bungie, the apparent live service masterminds who were supposed to help this whole plan come together. Instead, they have been largely subsumed by PlayStation themselves, and with their own game Marathon struggling to get out the door with never-ending controversies surrounding it, Bungie has been nothing more than a waste of time and money for Sony. It was an obvious knee-jerk reaction to Microsoft's acquisitions of Activision Blizzard and Bethesda. It went against the grain of Sony's historical stance of only acquiring teams they had a history with. It felt like they just went and picked up the biggest name that was available to show that they could, and they have gotten absolutely nothing of value from it. So I'll reiterate again. The decision to make these games or invest in these kinds of games is not the problem. The problem is that you invested in the wrong games and the wrong companies. The biggest irony here is that the only live service success PlayStation did manage, Helldivers 2, very clearly caught them by surprise. They barely marketed it, didn't have any merchandise or limited edition controllers ready, and didn't buy Arrowhead before the game was released like they had done with every other external studio they partnered with on these games. Do you understand how bad that looks? How do you make massive investments into Concord, Fair Games, and Bungie, but Helldivers 2 just slips right past you? Oh, and by the way, Helldivers 2 was in development for nearly 8 years, meaning it was greenlit under Shuhei Yoshida, not Herman Holst. So the PlayStation legend, who was seemingly pushed out of his role because he couldn't find multiplayer games, ended up finding the only successful new multiplayer game they've had this entire generation. And the new leadership apparently had no idea it was even going to do well. Fantastic stuff, guys. But are you ready for the craziest part? These external studios they invested in during the live service push aren't even the worst of it. These were misguided bets that didn't work out. But ultimately that doesn't really hurt any of us, it just hurts the pockets of a couple billionaires. But what does hurt us as the consumers is the amount of time PlayStation's top first-party teams wasted on this endeavor. And this is going to be where I think the term mismanagement really starts to take shape. The first example I'll give is the very public cancellation of Naughty Dog's Last of Us Online. What started as a multiplayer mode for The Last of Us Part 2 eventually became its own standalone project. Naughty Dog spent several years working on this game, and reportedly those who had played early builds said it was quite good. But suddenly, it was cancelled in December 2023. The reason they gave for the cancellation was that they realized supporting a live service game was just too much for the team to handle. It would require too many resources and hinder their ability to keep making the industry-defining single-player games they are known for. It's been nearly 2 years since The Last of Us Online was cancelled, and I still can't get it out of my mind. What do you mean they didn't know? What did they think live service meant? And more importantly, how did PlayStation management allow their most pivotal first-party studio to spend years developing a multiplayer game without ever having a conversation about how they were going to support it? That is one of the very first questions that should have been asked in the pitch room, not something that gets brought up multiple years down the line. Some of the blame does fall on Naughty Dog, who should have known what they were getting themselves into because it's kind of common sense. But most of it is on PlayStation Studios management, who are supposed to be there to help steer teams in the right direction, offering insight and support when needed. This mistake cost their top studio years of wasted time, and has left fans without a new Naughty Dog title for an entire console generation. What's even scarier is that Naughty Dog is not alone. They are just one of several PlayStation first-party teams to miss the PS5 era entirely due to this live service initiative, such as Bend Studio, the developers of Days Gone. Now, the Days Gone situation is a bit of a trickier one. The game was not very well received at launch due to technical issues. Those have been largely fixed now, and many who jumped in later became quite fond of it. But due to the negative initial reactions and some interpersonal issues within Bend's team, Sony chose to not greenlight a sequel. This sent Bend into an uncertain future, with many of the leaders who helped make Days Gone leaving the company. So Bend ended up following Sony's current initiative and working on a live service game. This is where I want to dispel a common statement that is untrue. Many seem to think Sony is forcing their teams to make these games, but it has been confirmed that this is not the case. Rather, their first-party teams are pitching these games to them, understanding that their project has a better chance of being picked up if it falls in line with what the company is currently valuing. So for a studio like Bend, who were at a crossroads and maybe didn't have the greatest relationship with Sony at the time, it made sense to pitch a game that fit what they seemingly wanted. But this is where PlayStation management continued making mistakes. Bend had no experience in the live service space, and no signs that they would be equipped to make a game like this. It's your responsibility to look at them and say, hey, we appreciate you trying to fit into what we're doing right now, but let's focus on something that's more in your wheelhouse. But instead, Bend wasted years on this multiplayer game before its cancellation in 2024. And with the team now having to start all over from scratch again, it is highly likely they will not release a single new game for the entire PS5 lifecycle. Admittedly though, it's not entirely clear what exactly this version of Bend's expertise even is. They are in many ways not the same studio that made Days Gone anymore, and I guess you could argue it made sense for Sony to try and see if they could make a multiplayer game work. But the first party studio you absolutely cannot make that argument for is Blue Point Games. You know Blue Point, right? The team known for their fantastic collections, remasters, and remakes of classic games. Well, would you believe me if I told you that since being acquired by Sony in 2021, this remake studio spent their time supporting development of God of War Ragnarok and working on a now cancelled God of War live service game? No, I'm not kidding. Now, I can live with the Ragnarok thing. I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but if Santa Monica signaled that they needed help, you get them help. Ragnarok is one of the most important games Sony will release this generation, and if getting Bluepoint involved helped it get out in time, it was worth it. But the live service game is where I draw the line. Somehow, someway, the management team at PlayStation decided this developer, who had been exclusively making remakes or ports for the last 15 years, should be given a live service multiplayer game. This takes us back to what I just said about Bend. It's obvious to see why Bluepoint pitched this game to Sony. They had all these God of War assets lying around from supporting Ragnarok and used Sony's live service push as an opportunity to make an original game, something that they had shown interest in doing in the past. But once again, this is where PlayStation management needs to step in and say no. They needed to sit that team down and explain to them the value of their remakes and to keep doing what they are good at, instead of trying to make a game in a genre you have absolutely zero experience in. Not to mention, a God of War live service game doesn't even sound like a good idea in the first place. And once again, this horrid decision making has left another first party team nowhere to be found. Bluepoint did have the Demon's Souls remake ready for launch, but now they've gone the entire rest of the generation with nothing. It is unacceptable to have what is supposed to be a remake studio release no games for 5+ years. So for those keeping track, that's 3 of their first party teams, including the most important one, who will essentially miss an entire console. And despite this giant tirade I just went on, I haven't even mentioned several of the other cancelled games, such as a Spider-Man multiplayer game from Insomniac, a new Twisted Metal, and London Studios live service game. Please tell me how anyone involved with this leadership team still has a job when I can't even discuss all of their failures without this video feeling too long to make. Under Hermen Hulst, there are fewer PlayStation first-party games being released than ever before. Early on, many of us gave him the benefit of the doubt, acknowledging that games take longer to make than they used to. This fact is undeniably true, and has certainly played a role in the lessening first-party output. But as time has gone on and more information has become publicly available, it's clear there was a lot more at play here than just increasing dev times. Hermen Hulst and the rest of PlayStation Studios management put themselves in this position with their poor decision-making. And while all of their studios have suffered layoffs or even closures as a result of these choices, management has been largely untouched. The only major change was Jim Ryan leaving in 2024, which was said to be a retirement. Most assume it was a mutual decision though, with Sony probably ready to move on from him as well. But who did they initially decide to replace Jim Ryan with? Hermen Hulst, of course, who was given the role of co-CEO alongside Hiroki Totoki. So the head of PlayStation First Party, who sent them down this awful path, was not only given no repercussions, but was actually promoted. It was only after the disastrous failure of Concord that Sony reversed this decision. Another sign that they truly had no idea that these live service projects were going to fail. However, after these games did very publicly fail, Hermen was quietly demoted. Totoki is now the sole CEO of PlayStation, with Hermen back in his role as head of the first party. I suppose this demotion could be seen as his punishment, but how did he even get elevated to that role in the first place? And he's still right back to the head of first party, so this problem isn't solved anyway. Let me slow down though. This video wasn't really meant to be a Hermen Hulst hate brigade. At the end of the day, all of the blame can't just fall on him. This is a top to bottom problem within PlayStation Studios management. Hermen has a very high rank in the company as head of the first party, but he still has many people he answers to. There are still people above him who needed to approve games like Concord or the God of War live service. There are still people above him who needed to sign off on spending nearly $4 billion on the husk of a once great Bungie. And there are still people around him who advised him on all of these atrocious decisions. These choices led to billions of lost dollars, and multiple first-party studios having no games for half a decade. If any lower-level employee made a mistake that caused something even half as damaging as that, they would be fired within the hour. And so the final thing I'll say is this. As of right now, this mismanagement hasn't affected the PlayStation console business very much, but they got extremely lucky that their top competitor Xbox imploded. If Microsoft had actually been firing on all cylinders a few years back like they are right now, we might have seen a totally different outcome. So while it may be easy to say that these mistakes weren't that costly, things can change very, very quickly. They are seriously tempting fate right now. And as a longtime PlayStation fan, I've truly never been less confident in their ability to deliver consistent first-party experiences. And until some kind of meaningful leadership alteration is put into place, I don't see that changing anytime soon.